So good afternoon or good morning or indeed good evening, depending upon where in the world you're tuning into this webinar from Global Cit. This webinar on citizenship, populism and populism, a 21st century challenge across the globe, will run for 90 minutes, and there will be 4 short papers and time for Q&A at the end. My name is Jo Shaw, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Global Cit Observatory, as well as a professor at the universities of Edinburgh and Tampere. It's been my pleasure to design and convene this webinar, and I'm very excited to tell you about the truly international cohort of speakers and topics we have today, as well as a little about the way we're going to approach the topic. Populism is definitely a very topical issue for us to discuss, although some might think that it sits a little way away from some of the main core concerns of our observatory, with its focus on acquisition and loss of citizenship, and more recently on electoral rights as one of the most important rights of citizens, and of course the rights of those whose status is regarded as close enough to citizenship for them to be given rights to vote in some countries. Now, populism is a contested political phenomenon. We're not necessarily going to agree either across the panel or with the audience about a definition, but most of us are probably going to agree that its rise represents one of the central challenges to the ideals of equal citizenship across the globe. Reflecting a variety of both top-down and bottom-up perspectives on populism, the papers in this webinar will draw on case studies from India, Western Europe, Latin America, and elsewhere in order to illuminate engagements between citizenship, democracy, and the people. It's sometimes hard to say for sure that any changes to citizenship regimes of particular countries are the result of populist politics, or products of the claim that we should be distinguishing between a pure or true people and others, whether an allegedly corrupt elite or those who lack some characteristics such as ethnic belonging, language, or religion, which is supposed to give an entrance ticket to full membership of the polity. But the practice of populist politics often gives rise to enhanced contestation around political membership, as we shall see. Now, that's far too much from me. We're going to listen to 4 papers, each of them around 15 minutes, and then there will be time for Q&A, which will be managed via the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom window. So please type your questions into that box, and I will read them out and manage the responses of the speakers. If you've got a question to a particular speaker, please make sure that you put it in that, address it to a particular speaker, or you can make it a more general question to the panel as a whole. So the first speaker will be Sarah Wallace-Goodman, and she's speaking on citizenship, national populism, and democratic contestation of the We group. Sarah is an associate professor of political science at the University of California at Irvine. Ulrika Wheaton will be our second speaker, and she's speaking on anti-hygienic outrage, citizens' right to protest, and far-right populist mobilization. Ulrika is an assistant professor in sociology and fellow of the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice at Queen's University, Belfast. Our third speaker is Sanjeev Barua. He'll be speaking on populist or majoritarian citizenship, inclusions and exclusions in contemporary India. Sanjeev is a professor of political studies at Bard College and is the author of a book called In the Name of the Nation, India and its Northeast. Lindsay Micah is our our final speaker, and she's speaking on citizen participation, populism, and repressive policing in Latin America. Lindsay is an assistant professor of government at Colby College. So now I've introduced the speakers, we'll be able to proceed smoothly from one to the other. The first speaker will be Sarah Wallace-Goodman. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Jo. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Apologies I was late. I am facilitating kindergarten and 3rd grade from home. I have a hands full this morning. good morning, by the way, it's 9 a.m. here. So I'm going to talk a bit about what I'm thinking about recently in regards to populism and citizenship, and sort of what the stakes are for the liberal democratic state moving forward when we think about citizenship. And I'm going to present some early evidence of ongoing work in progress on how populist parties think about citizenship in Western Europe. So I'm interested in all things citizenship, politics, policy, practice, meaning, centrally meaning. I really like to think a lot about what citizenship means. And in this context, populists are really oddly situated in the politics of citizenship. Right, so populists ask, so fundamentally, when we think about constitutively who they are, right, as a political movement, as an idea, right, that they ask who belongs and who decides, right? So if we use, as Joe said, right, it's an essentially contested concept, but if we were to use Casmuta's definition, right, we think about this as this thin ideology where that represents the pure people against the corrupt elite, right? Where the party represents the general will of the people, right? So fundamentally, its essence, right? It is sort of structured around who belongs, like how they define the pure people of that group, and who decides, right? Their answer would be they decide, right? They represent the people. But if we can also take those exact same questions and ID kind of the field of citizenship, right? Where the answers might be different. So we can think about who belongs, who decides, and based on a different group of respondents or government in power, the answers to those questions might be different. But the fact that they kind of overlap in this nexus, it provides an interesting starting point to think about how populist parties are both authoritatively poised to answer some of these questions. And it's not just that they are authoritatively poised, it's that they are democratically positioned to do so. So in principle, then, we think about this nexus as creating an opportunity. It's a natural issue area. So they are authoritatively, democratically contesting national identity as an extension of who they are, but also in a venue that matches or dovetails those interests. So here, I'll briefly note how challenging citizenship is kind of like challenging the regime level itself. So the picture here just shows a snapshot of an article that sort of speaks to these more regime level concerns, liberal democracy, national identity boundaries, and populist entry points in critical review. And so what in this essay I discuss is that not only do liberal democratic states tolerate and encourage this contestation, but it's fundamentally caught in a conflict by the imperative to maintain flexible boundaries. So liberal democratic states need flexible boundaries based on the liberal imperative to make adjustments to the inclusion criteria over time. And they also need boundaries based on the democratic imperative to administratively run a state. They need to know who they can extract resources from, provide resources to, identify in kind of the James Scott version of a state, but also of a variant sense of the state. So we can locate the citizenship nexus as kind of like this parallel to the liberal democratic state and the imperatives of flexible boundaries. It makes them vulnerable to these populist attacks along as we see populist challenges or populists challenge both the malleability and legitimacy. And in fact, and this is the sort of the takeaway I think from this article, is that populists are primed to respond to the very thing that liberal states need to do, that is maintain malleable boundaries. So in thinking about that and how we sort of interrogate this nexus, I ask a series of questions. What do populists say about citizenship? What do their discursive choices reveal about their supporters? Their supporters ranging from different theories that include, right, the Ford Goodwin Left Behind, the Rennie Justin Guest et al. Nostalgia motive, the racially resentful, if you look at the US literature. And then what do we observe in terms of variation or consistency in the positions and the content of citizenship across populist parties? So do populist parties on the right look like or speak about citizenship in the same ways that populist parties on the left speak about citizenship? Europe provides good variation for answering those questions. And I will say right now that I may disappoint a little in this talk because I ask more questions than I have opportunities to answer, because it is a raging pandemic and I just didn't have time to do everything. I will give insight into what I've done so far, where I'm heading, and kind of what my thinking is for moving forward. So what do we already know? We know that exclusionary populism is mostly about nativism. So I would direct everyone to read the interesting new piece by David Art in Perspectives on Politics, where he sort of says, we should stop using the term populism altogether because what we're really talking about is nativism. And he sort of props this as a global standard, though in an interesting blog post by Tom Popinski, he notes the entire exclusion of the entire continent of Asia in this discussion of a global standard for populism. However, that said, we can locate in terms of Western Europe a core to populism, or what Muda and Kasbalter would discuss as exclusionary populism, as this core of nativism, right? So we know that this is a preoccupation of populist parties, that they're both anti-immigrant and anti-multiculturalism. Sometimes they're even socially progressive in how they present anti-Islam or Islamophobic messages. I have a forthcoming piece with Trevor Allen that looks at the socially progressive correlates of far-right female supporters. But we know that populist parties express themselves through these terms of belonging, right? And it's a choice to frame immigration perspectives in terms of identity, right? Historically, it was different. Historically, it's about labor market competition, et cetera. These, however, I contend are indirectly about the populace. They're about the deficiencies of outsiders. And so we infer from these descriptions that they are about defining in-group standards, but we wanna look further to see if we see positive affirmations, not just kind of negative delimitations about what it means to belong. The second thing we know about populist parties is that they are effective. So they can block liberalization. They can make citizenship policy more restrictive. And again, so all these works, right, tell us that this is the case, show us that this is the case, but this is kind of a citizenship by proxy argument. It's not that their policy changes or policy position affects policy outcomes, but it's the nativist popularity squeeze that they put on center-right parties. So we want to look at what their positions are and whether positions 10 years ago manifest in similar policies today. So where I go next here is, how do they talk about citizenship, right? Do we see these descriptions? How do they vary across parties on the political spectrum? So I have some evidence. So just to structure what we're looking at here, we want to know who talks about citizenship among populist parties, when they talk about citizenship, how frequently they talk about citizenship, in what ways, and do we see variations and similarities? I can answer a couple of these. So first, we're looking at overall salience so what I do is I look at party manifestos using the new data set from Danziger and Margulies and CPS last year. The top figure here shows DEMIG data, which is De Hassanal's changes in citizenship policy. So the more changes we see, the more inclusionary policy becomes in that citizenship in that year in aggregate. So this is across 23 European countries. And then the bottom is the salience of citizenship mentions in party manifestos, and that's just a count on the y-axis we see. So we're plotting inclusionary citizenship policy on top and total mentions of citizenship policies in European party manifestos on the bottom. And we see there's a relationship on the passage of inclusive citizenship policy and eventual citizenship position taking across the parties. So in the 2000s, this equates to an average of 6 mentions per party manifesto, just as a sense of proportionality to the total manifesto output. But 6 mentions means it's not one sentence, right? It is a distinct policy position that is taken, right? You'll see 2 or 3 sentences then that mention citizenship. It's a distinct policy position. The question then is what makes populist parties strong, right? It here is still open for interpretation, but focusing on political mobilization around citizenship, even when they do not prevail at the ballot box, reveals the centrality of the politics of displacement or boundary maintenance in advanced liberal democracies. So it's not correlated to how much, vote. I'm not looking at like vote percentage, right, for parliament, but we see that just kind of the mentions are a good indicator of how frequently this, or I said mentions or salience is an indicator kind of the positioning of populists on this issue. Now, what I'm showing you at the bottom here, of course, is aggregate. It's all parties. So we see that in response to large changes in citizenship in the 90s, we see then sort of a decade in heightened salience of citizenship mentions in party manifestos. So now we want to move to who talks about citizenship. And here we see that this is really a phenomenon driven by the far right. The far right is not just mentioning citizenship more, it's spurring others, particularly as I talked about that squeeze to the center right, spurring others to mention citizenship. So salience is driven by parties on the far right. We see evidence of a contagion effect. And of course, change is happening, right? And this means that the discourse matters. When the far right starts talking about citizenship, other parties do too. And I think the interesting takeaway here is that, of course, as we know, citizenship was changing this whole time period. And so this also suggests, and this is kind of the direction I see, that it also suggests that we see the transformation here of citizenship from this administrative issue to this political issue when parties start talking about it versus the previous decade when parties were just changing things. So that can be a real effect, potential effect, right? It needs to sort of be tested more rigorously. The effect of just discourse and mentioning citizenship more frequently, making it a position of in one's manifesto. So what's going on in progress is content analysis of these citizenship mentions, how they topic model, how they relate to other words, and whether the left looks like the right, whether far right populist parties look like one another, an analysis of salience, so why citizenship has comparatively fewer mentions than, say, immigration and integration policies. So when do parties talk about citizenship versus these other issue areas? If anyone in the audience is interested in this topic, email me. I'm always in the hunt for co-authors as I'm when I'm not facilitating kindergarten. I wanted to conclude it there and I think that we need to take real serious just the discourse shift itself. So even perspective talk about citizenship makes it a discussable topic. We think about Trump's just mentioning of ending birthright citizenship in the US via executive order, that it enters the realm of possibility, even discussing it. So we need to pay attention to this nexus, to salience and discourse cues, and citizenship, of course, when it isn't functioning as a passport, is really nothing but a national self-understanding. So how people decide and who gets to choose what that means matters significantly. And I will end on a shameless plug that Oxford University Press is now have a new series on studies of migration and citizenship, co-edited by myself, Justin Guess, and Willem Maas. So if you are working on a manuscript, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much. We'll move straight over to Ulrika, and she'll present her paper.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Joe, for approaching me. I mean, it's just brilliant if you write something and then people read it and get interested. So I'm very appreciating the chance. What I'm doing in the next 12, 15 minutes, I'm drawing on some of the core arguments or the stuff I'm presenting in the paper, but it's of course also related to previous work I published with Scott Pointing in 2016, a special issue on racist, what we call racist far-right populism. And it's also a work in progress, which will be hopefully published a book next year on the normalization of the global far-right. So as a sociologist, I might also have a kind of different take as in comparison to Sarah or some people who rather come from political science and law. So it's less in that sense on citizenship in terms of legal rights framework, but rather, or what struck me as relevant, the pandemic moment in itself, because on the one hand, in the recent period, we had this rise of the far right in different ways as political party representation. But my question again is rather, in what ways does mainstream society or does society basically pick up core approach and identities and normative frameworks presented or rather extreme previously and now becoming mainstream? So I'm looking here more specifically at what's called anti-hygienic protest in Germany, which by now also probably in the international news, and I will get back to this later, indicates some really confusion, because on the one side, Germany and Chancellor Merkel seem to be very competent in navigating, at least in spring, the health pandemic crisis. And it's the same Germany where this protest emerged on the streets and online as well. So who are the anti-hygienic protesters? Querdenken 711, and you might translate this with like thinking outside of the box. In the beginning, I did not even know what 711 means, but now I know it's a dialing code for Stuttgart. So it's very explicitly referring also to the location where the founder of this group, who is Michael Ballweg, an IT expert specialist, emerged this group this year. So the profile of this initiative explicitly speaks to German citizens' individual rights guaranteed in the German constitutional law. So they claim on the one side, as citizens, we have the right to go to the street, we have the right to protest what's going on in the politics sphere. And though it's started in Stuttgart, by now there are lots of different groups across the country, across the German Republic. And some of you might know that the first bigger demonstration took place at the beginning of August with roughly 20,000 participants. At the end of August, already doubled, 40,000. And most recently in Leipzig, which is rather in the east of Germany, again, 45,000 people participating in this demonstration. And from the initial outrage, or some people might call this more the peaceful protest, it developed by now into a very aggressive demonstrations. And I'm not even speaking in the way they disregard the hygienic orders to wear face masks, but also attacking journalists and intimidating other people. So what now turns out as highly problematic, and that's where the discussions and debate on far-right populism kick in, that this civil group or civil rights group or social protest movement on the one hand could claim a right to demonstrate, to make their anger heard, but that right from the start, they were not willing and not able to have really or keep strict boundaries against the far-right groups. For example, a group called Reichsbürger, Citizens of the Reich, very explicitly against everything that stands for German democracy and constitution. So though it might count as social protest movement, and I'm again referring to this group Querdenken, and there's also another one which is called Widerstand 2020, so Resistant 2020. They basically mobilize at least a significant minority in Germany beyond any ideological division of left or right. In the end, they actually don't care. So I saw, for example, a video more recently where speakers clearly were praising or were at basically agreeing that it's good for the cause that far-right aggressive attackers, violent demonstrators are part of the demonstrations. And the point I'm making, or I'm trying to be clear on this, both groups come from the center of society. Both groups are founded by professionals, lawyers, medical teachers, artists, entrepreneurs. So it's very much a kind of middle-class white movement that's emerging here. And it's not yet established, but years ago there was a group organizing also resistance again an enlargement of the Stuttgart main train station. So it was called Stuttgart 21. And there are also kind of emerging linkages between the same group of white middle-class people clearly claiming a form of entitlement to a certain degree, that they want to go back to their initial way of life. And as I said, the group functions as a melting pot for people who do hold skeptical views on the current government health strategies. But what the danger I'm basically highlighting is that at least a third by now of those affiliated or identifying with this movement are actually from the far right. So it's a third already of participants in demonstrations, but speaking of online activity, are rather located in the extreme right field. So what do they want? That's what they do. The role as protest movement means that they, on the one hand, challenge the government policy quite clearly. They reject wearing face masks, but it's also about mothers, for example, or parents who reject any idea of vaccination. If you now more recently have discussions and debate in the news that people get excited that in a couple of weeks or months, we might have vaccinations. So these are people basically completely rejecting this. What's more important, I think, is that it's also signifying that there is a kind of lack of identification and solidarity in the end, because a larger group of those identifying and organizing these demonstrations regard the COVID-19 virus as not as dangerous as it is claimed worldwide by different nation states. So the QAnon, and some of you might have heard about this organization as well, is also part of what might be labeled conspiracy theories, that the actual virus doesn't exist and the policy and politics is playing into actually companies, Bill Gates as one who is identified as the one who is benefiting and making profits out of it. So the linkage then to the party politics is also highly problematic, as the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, the far-right party, is in the Bundestag, is parliamentary active since 2017, so for 2-3 years by now. And they managed recently also to bring in protesters. So I think 2 or 3 of the anti-hygienic demonstrators were basically smuggled into the Bundestag, which created a situation where these people intimidated and harassed other members of the political parties, of the Green Party, of the Social Democrats, and you have it. And that's, of course, a kind of threshold, and I have to say, completely reminding anyone of fascist methods. So we have already kind of passed, if I might say so, a situation where we could argue or say, okay, this is only a small proportion of people who are active, but quite the opposite. There is a kind of atmosphere of harassment and intimidation going on. That's very scary. So, and to finish, and of course, those who are interested in this should read the paper, the normalization, or that's part of my argument, the normalization is something that took place and is a process actually. Yeah, I'm speaking as a sociologist, of course,
Thank you very much, Ulrike. Thank you, great for keeping to time. We'll move immediately now to Sanjeeb, and I believe he's going to share some slides as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Gio, for inviting me. What I have done actually since writing the abstract, read some of your work and Joe's work, and especially I think I read Sarah Goodman's work actually. So you'll find my presentation to be slightly different from the abstract, but closer to the theme of the panel. I'm going to read out because I'm very bad at keeping time. So I made some notes. I'll begin as my start point. Moderator Joe shows observation that the populist movement represents a challenge to the discursive space within which citizenship is constructed and contested. India's current ruling party, the BJP, is a populist party in an ideological sense. Like all populists, it presents itself as a true defender of the real or true people against corrupt elites that have equally usurped sovereignty. Populists classically exploit two things: the gap between the promise of democracy that the people shall rule and actually existing representative democracies, and B, the inherently unstable nature of national identities and the boundaries of national communities. For the BJP, the corrupt elites conspiring against the people include the English language media, secular intellectuals, political parties of the left, NGOs, and most importantly, the Congress Party and the Gandhi family. For years, the Congress Party President Sonia Gandhi's Italian and Catholic background gave BJP ideologues an excuse to question the party's national credentials. BJP, of course, presents its mission as one of returning the sovereignty usurped by elites to its true owner, the people. The BJP's challenge to the discursive space of citizenship, however, can only be understood by referring to the foundational event of the partition of 1947, the division of British India into the two separate states, India and Pakistan, on supposedly sectarian lines. Next slide, please. Yeah, that you would know. It was the British India was divided into India and Pakistan, and it was divided again. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is the current map where the old British India is now divided into 3 countries. The partition was violent, and there's a massive flow of migrants. And because after all, the partition was based, or supposedly based on sectarian lines, people who were supposed to be on the wrong side of the border, quote unquote wrong, clearly moved. And what's interesting and not always known is that actually the flow of partition-related migration has continued. And not only people on quote unquote on the wrong side of the border, as you will see, much more than that. So for populists, as my co-panelist Sarah Goodman puts it, focus on immigration is politically strategic because out-group antipathy is essential to strengthening in-group affinity. For the BJP, however, what has been politically strategic for the same reason, is a specific focus on partition-related migration flows. Next slide, please. So that I would like you to spend some time on is the article, how the Article 1 of the Constitution defines India. It has two names, which is more significant than recognized. And then you would notice, you would not know the word Bharat, but I will talk about it. And next slide, please. See, the BJP's name is also that. So actually the translation, I would argue, is more problematical than it seems. And we just think it's just a simple translation. It is not. So to say that Bharat is a translation of India is to miss the main story. It is a juxtaposition of Bharat versus India that I would argue has allowed Hindu nationalists to mount a powerful challenge in the discursive space of citizenship because of the inherently unstable nature of national identities. The Indian Constitution was inaugurated in 1950. During the debates in the Constituent Assembly, members rarely used the term Bharat during the speeches to refer to the country. They did it only during the discussion of the name. For most of the time, clearly, some people spoke in, as you know, India is very multilingual, apart from English. So clearly, you'll have to refer to the country in the 2-year, 3-year-long debates. So people use, more often they would use India or a term called Hindustan. And what is interesting, that the word Hindustan doesn't appear anymore, Bharat appears. So why that's the case, I won't get into it, but I can get into it in the Q&A if necessary. India or Bharat, I would argue, reflects a foundational debate about the idea of India that doesn't neatly follow the Hindu nationalist secular divide. Bharat indeed is a name that appears in ancient Sanskrit texts, such as the Puranas, but it didn't refer to a political entity. It was part of a cosmological discourse that inscribes human activities within a grand spatio-temporal frame, the world of order, and outside of it is the world of disorder. Right? The word, however, acquired a new meaning during the colonial period. By the mid-19th century, educated Hindus began to use the word Bharat for the territory mapped and organized by the British under the name India, which means India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. So I'm citing Nitasha Kaul, her words, who says the Hindutva version of India is Bharat, which stands not just for a country that is India, but also connotes an ideal of pure Hindu morality where there is no westernization or perceived ills. This point was underscored. I'll give you an example. Some of you may know about 2012, where there was a dreadful gang rape, which got a lot of international attention. The major Hindu nationalist leader's response to it was, such crimes hardly take place in Bharat, but they frequently occur in India. So that tells you how significant the two terms are. Now, however, let me go back to the question of migration, the post-partition migration. The next slide, please. So I think these are also important to understand. It is because, as you know, we take for granted, especially when we discuss North America, Western Europe, we assume the identification revolution, which is, of course, Gerard Noriel's term. The greatly enhanced capacity of modern states to individually identify its citizens in order to legally differentiate between citizens and aliens. What people tend to underestimate, that capacity doesn't exist in many places in the world, right? So you can imagine that in a place like India, and some of you know the work called Paper Citizens by Kamal Sadiq, which is really about that. So then you not only have others coming in, you really have, they vote as well, right? So in fact, Kamal Sadiq has a wonderful term called suffrage non-citizens. So then you can imagine. So the kind of issues involved then, that is what gives the context. The Bharat versus India, the partition, and the fact that identification revolution is still a work in progress, right? Happening in a context where really in a frontier region in Northeast India, on which actually I have a book, fairly recent book published by Stanford University Press. Clearly, that area becomes quite interesting. That area, I would argue, is the locus of all these debates. So what is interesting that recent discussions of National Register of Citizens, Citizenship Amendment Bill, all of that takes India as a whole. What is interesting is that all of that starts there, the area on which I have written. So next slide, please. So the National Register of Citizens. I can get into it. There will be limited time, so I'll try my best. It's clearly the fact that it's called updating itself is interesting. That means there is a register which has to be updated, right? And this took place during 2014-19, got a lot of attention, including of the Global SIP project, right? And mind you, monitored by the Indian Supreme Court. So it is clearly, it precedes the BJP, rise of BJP, right? So in a way that it grows out of this enormous conflict about this issue, suffrage citizens, continued migration, who is a citizen, who is not. That I would argue has been a major theme of this region's politics for the last 30 years, way before BJP came into the picture, right? So that forced them to get into the question, and which, as many of you know, led to the exclusion of 1.9 million people in the final register. But I want you to sort of flag all of that. The fact that the National Register of Citizens happened only in one state of India, right? And in fact, what's interesting to me is that I go to India quite a bit to study all this. Actually, people in the rest of India had no idea what is the National Register of Citizens when it began to get attention in 2014-15. But everybody in the area, on the border area, knows, next to what is now Bangladesh, migration happens there. This whole issue about who is a citizen was really part of the politics of the area. And then, as I promised to talk about the Citizenship Amendment Bill, then you'll see the connection with Bharat, etc. Next slide, please. So this has got a lot of attention. So this clearly happened under the BJP. It is a law passed exactly a year ago, less than a year, last December, which theoretically, it makes easier for non-Muslim immigrants from India's 3 Muslim majority neighbors, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, to become citizens of India. It just facilitates it. It sort of makes it a faster track, if you like. What's interesting is, however, until then, despite migration, actually migration, so in a way, till now, till this law was passed, Indian citizenship law didn't really distinguish whether a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian. So in a way, or whether you came from Europe or came from Pakistan. So in some ways, partition was expected to be concluded soon after the partition, but that's not the reality. So what happens is migration really did not follow what the architects of the partition expected, right? So in that particular region, not only Hindus, which are supposed to be on the wrong side of the border, kept crossing, you also have poor Muslims who really, I think of the Northeast India as one of the frontier regions, of Asia, where it was sparsely populated. Yeah, was sparsely populated. Thank you. So as a result, not surprising, migration continued. So that will also tell you why migration, citizenship, foreigner, non-foreigner was a central theme in the politics of this region for the last 30 years, right? So BJP's intervention then, it is really, it was an entry point, to use Sarah's term, right? It was a very convenient entry point. For them, however, it becomes very important. If all these people are coming, some people are clearly more legitimate than others, right? And what's interesting, it is not a BJP position either. So what's interesting is that Hindutva then, clearly you have the Hindutva in an assertive sense and a soft Hindutva, almost normalized idea that clearly Hindus will keep coming, right? Then, because after all, that was the basis of the partition. So you can see then, so it is so the populist intervention then of BJP, all of that is there, but cannot be understood without its history, without its ideological history, without the history of the partition, right? That is what really makes populism so potent in terms of an intervention in the discursive space of citizenship. I think I'll end here at the moment, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev, raising lots of questions. And that gives me a good opportunity to remind everybody that if they want to submit questions, then please do so via the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom. You just need to type your question and say whether it's for an individual or whether it's for the panel as a whole. And we've got time for questions because the speakers so far have kept marvelously to time. So moving on now, Lindsay Micah is the last of the 4 speakers.
All right. Thank you, everyone. So get started. a little starting point that I'd like to say is that as somebody who studies Latin America and who's a political scientist, but kind of one that is leaning increasingly more and more towards sociology, I have a bit of a different way of thinking about citizenship, especially given the nature of Latin America, where immigration isn't as much of a pressure as we see other places. A lot of the debates about citizenship have been more about the experience of citizenship, the informal and constantly reproduced understandings of who belongs and who is on the outside, what rights entail, and who gets to be a real citizen, than actual formal boundaries. And so that's part of what I want to talk about today, of thinking about the relationship between participation among citizens, populism, and then the role of repressive policing in separating out some of those boundaries. So one of my starting points here is thinking about the grassroots foundation of populism. Not so much talking just about populist parties, but thinking about populism as an ongoing project. And in the prior years, before you see the rise of populist parties, civil society plays a key role in laying out the ideological schema, the discursive foundations, some of the understandings of who the people are. Right? What does it mean to be a citizen? Who should be included? And so that some of those scripts can get constructed over time through civil society participation. So that's sort of one of the starting points that I'm working from. This is one of the roles of civil society. And so starting from my first book, I looked at the role of participatory institutions in expanding citizenship. And participatory institutions are state-sponsored venues that involve civil society directly in the policy-making process. So rather than having them simply be involved through protests or lobbying, giving them an actual seat at the table. This is something that we see throughout the Global South, but in particular in Latin America. And it's been introduced as part of, or following the third wave of democracy, as a way to deepen democracy, to reduce inequalities. And what we see is that it's also part of expanding citizenship. So ways that it can expand citizenship, I'm going to also lay out 3 criteria that I'm going to come back to throughout this presentation. So setting the boundaries. These participatory institutions that have been set up often have formal requirements to recognize the role of marginalized groups that have historically been excluded from politics. So bringing them in and saying, well, we're not just going to rely on the old practices that go along with liberal democracy in terms of saying which groups get a voice, but actually creating spots for groups that have been historically let out. So you're expanding the boundaries of who gets to be included. And doing so through a political process of intermediation. So you're connecting those marginalized groups to the state, not just recognizing them, but creating the seat at the table where they can be involved in discussion. So that's a part of citizenship, of connecting citizens to the state. And then also being part of expanding rights, the content of citizenship. And so these participatory institutions have largely been used to extend social rights for some of these marginalized groups, extending benefits from healthcare and education, infrastructure development programs, to expand them so that the state is actually reaching new groups, that those groups that may have formal social rights on paper, that you can actually deepen the experience of those rights. And what this ends up happening, in addition to some of the concrete effects of participatory institutions, that these sites also become a site to construct new discourses about rights and citizenship, of who belongs, who gets to have these, like this expansion of these boundaries, this process, these rights. It's part of what Evelina Dagnino, who's a Brazilian political scientist, has called the right to have rights. And so through participatory institutions, you're expanding this. And this is something that populist projects on the left have been able to tap into and talk about this new conception of citizenship, about who really belongs. So this is sort of like a happy, optimistic, through participation, we can expand citizenship, looking at a lot of these benefits. And then as time has gone on, it's 2020, I've grown more cynical myself. So I've been turning towards thinking about issues of policing and repression in Latin America. So going into some research now that I have been doing with Yanilda Gonzalez of Harvard, looking at the role of participation in the sector of policing and how that can expand citizenship rights. Most of the literature that I've talked about in the past have been focusing on social policy areas or in policies specifically for the rights of certain marginalized groups like Black, Latin Americans, or women, or people with disabilities. So what happens when you have more participation through participatory institutions in policing? This is different because policing follows explicitly a logic of violence and coercion. It's not about distributing benefits, but also about doing so through coercion. And what this can mean is that greater protection for some comes explicitly through state violence and the violation of basic rights against others. So what we see here is that there is quite a bit of support for repressive policing. This isn't something simply that that cops are doing against the wishes of people. There's actually deep-seated support for the use of violence against certain marginalized groups. So some of the work that we're doing looking at this tracks the rise of discourses promoting violence against people who are experiencing homelessness, against street vendors. People won't explicitly say, they won't use racial terms, but it's in practice understood that it's against Black youth often. And so we see quite a wellspring in society, not towards expansion of citizenship, but towards contraction of citizenship for groups that are seen as being a problem. And so through participatory institutions and through the work I'm doing with Yanilda Gonzalez, we're looking at participatory security policing institutions in the state of Sao Paulo that bring together police officers and groups from the community and just individual citizens in talking about problems of insecurity that they see in their communities. We see a contraction of citizenship in terms of the discourses around citizenship. So participation in policing here builds new discourses and repeats and deepens some of those discourses that justify repressive policing, not just as a demand, but as something that is a citizenship right, that people have a right to have the police use violence against others. And so in this paper, what we see is that these participatory spaces become sites where you set boundaries. So there's often complaining, oh, they have too many rights, you know, they have all these, the law protects them, but it shouldn't. And you see these groups that are defined in their very presence as threatening in an area. So people will come to these meetings and complain about somebody who is experiencing homelessness being in an area. It's not that that person is actually threatening or violent or committing a crime, but their very presence demands removal because there's something that is threatening about them. And so you're defining them as a threat to citizenship, not as somebody who is entitled to the benefits of citizenship themselves. We see these processes. So in practice, marginalized groups, and we have somebody who is from the homelessness movement here, are excluded from participatory venues. Some of the anecdotes we have from interviews, but also through participant observation, shows that some of these groups actually experience violence when they try to come. They are mocked, they are pushed out of the spaces that they technically have the right to, but there's an understanding that those aren't the people who are supposed to be participating. They're not the real members of the community, and they're constantly questioned, even physically threatened if they try to have voice. And then the content of citizenship, it comes down to that the repression of these marginalized groups is required to protect the rights of good citizens. One of the things that's interesting here is how much citizenship language people talk about. They often will start their, like when they're coming up to speak in front of the group, they'll say, well, I am a citizen, I pay my taxes, and they present themselves, I am a good citizen, and therefore I am deserving of this. And what they're saying as a citizen that they are deserving of is that the state come in and use violence against people who are understood to be up to no good, even if they're not actually committing a crime. So there's something here about that to protect my rights, you have to actively use force and violence against this other group of people because they aren't real citizens. So we see here the reproduction of ideas about who belongs and who does not belong, about who has rights and who does not have rights through citizen participation. That unlike in some of the other areas, you don't see the expansion of citizenship rights, but the informal contraction. And part of the implications of this is that these discourses have been going on for years and have been reproduced through these spaces for civil society. What I think that they do is that they provide a template that has been sanitized, that other politicians can step in and use. So here we have pictures of Jair Bolsonaro, the current president of Brazil, who's far-right populist leader, who has used a lot of language of the need for extermination, of undesirable people, of being really tough on crime, and sending the military in to use brutal repression against people. He's drawing on ideas and discourses that have actually been constructed. He's not saying, oh, this is against rights. He's saying, this is for rights. This is for my rights. And this is for the rights of the real people that we need to implement this. And so you're building up these discourses that parties can later draw on and amplify in the way. And this is something that I was thinking about with Ulrike, with her presentation, where you have civil society as sort of an entry point, and then it can metastasize into something bigger and more expansive when it becomes connected to some of these parties. So overall takeaway points, the civil society can play a key role in struggles over citizenship, both in expanding citizenship rights, but also in contracting citizenship rights and building up some of those ideas that people are not worthy of these protections. And that repressive policing that violates basic rights can actually be packaged as essential for citizenship itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Thank you to all the speakers for keeping so incredibly well to time that we've now got half an hour, a full half hour for the Q&A. You can type the Q&A, any questions in the box at the bottom, or you can also send a message to the participants if you want through the chat function, which we can see. I'm going to start off by asking Sarah to address a question that has been put to her by Martin Vink, which Sarah's read and you all can, but the question that he's asking is really about citizenship salience amongst the populist right and not or less amongst the populist left. Does this mean that the salience of citizenship is more about identity politics, e.g. cultural issues and nativism, and less about political economy? If so, why? And does this reflect ambivalent views on migration amongst the ideological left more generally? Sarah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you everyone for your presentations. I learned so much. And thank you to Martin for the question. It would not be an EUI talk if Martin had not asked a question. And I'm sorry I can't see you and Reiner, and I know everyone else in the audience, and it's lovely to see you in this capacity. So this is one of the questions I'm thinking about in terms of variation, right? Why we see it on the right and less on the left. It's not to say we don't see it on the left at all. And, you know, when I mapped out the differences, there weren't enough mentions on the far left to see a line really, but that's not to say that there aren't mentions. And so this is why it's really important to pair these sort of quantitative overviews, right, where we have this manifesto data with this in-depth look at the content itself. And this is kind of also reflecting the tension I spoke about earlier about when parties mention citizenship is in sort of, you know, positive description terms, not normatively positive, but like identifying dimensions of citizenship versus negatively delimiting them by who does not belong. And so on the right, you do see all these connections with immigration, but so then let's look and see how the left talks about it. So I wanted to use one example, Greece, right? Because it offers variation for us. And so how does Syriza talk about citizenship? Well, so one example I'm thinking about in 2012, right? is in their manifesto, the mention of citizenship is not even in regard to immigration. It's not even in regard to Greece. It's in regard to Israel, right? So they're arguing for a national federation with one sovereignty, one international personality, one citizenship, right? So its citizenship is not even conceived of in like as or seen as part of their own national platform, but as part of foreign policy. This changes by 2015. So we see that as citizenship in Greece is becoming more part of the international discourse, that Syriza is taking a position on this. So they start mentioning citizenship for second generation children. So this is kind of just like the right, it's tied to immigration, but it's sort of identifying a new constituency for national belonging. We also see a mention about citizenship in Cyprus and about Turkish occupying troops. So we see citizenship as part of foreign policy positions on the left. And so yes, you know, one hypothesis is it's about political economy, where we see far left parties traditionally stake out positions, but also that they can talk about citizenship in this other policy venue. For example, when we look at Golden Dawn, right, their mentions of citizenship are about stripping citizenship of those who refuse their duty to their homeland, right? So we do see that the content itself matters. It reflects not just party ideology, but also sort of these buckets of policies where citizenship may also be seen, right? So it's either patriotism, nationalism, or it can be part of foreign policy, or it could be political economy. And all these are hypotheses, right? They're all testable. And that's why sort of a broader analysis, I think, needs to be conducted. Thank you for the question.
Okay, I'll turn to a second question that's come in from Alexandra Dubova. She has a question for Ulrika, and her question is, do you think that the fact that the people stay at home during COVID lockdown and have more time working from home, spending more time on social media than usual, surely not, contributes to their discontent and turn to the far right populist ideas? And then she says, I think about the middle class group of people you described as joining the demonstrations. Maybe the lack of activity during the lockdown sparked the necessity to act in whatever way.
Yes, thanks, Alexandra. Thanks for asking this question. I mean, I would answer in two directions, actually. I think the thing you mentioned would rather mean that people are bored, so they tend also lacking the usual communication in the public sphere where people interact and can socialize. So definitely turning to the internet or to social media. And there is already research emerging. In my paper, I also refer to this findings already by other colleagues, showing that there is an intensification of turning to extremist views, which might include far right, but also other extremist views. But we don't have to, or we shouldn't underestimate that another part that's basically contributing to this is the lack of clear, cohesive strategy. And I'm speaking now, I'm living now in Northern Ireland, and I can tell you we just have 1 week where people can go shopping and to the hairdresser and you have it for 1 week. And from Friday on, everything will be locked down for 14 days, which creates this nice yo-yo effect that probably it will trigger a lot of infections, if you know what I mean. So there is some other problem going on that has to do with the lack of clear governance, not only in specific countries. Let's say in Germany, we have federal lands, 16 federal lands. They struggle hard now, very hard, to come up with a cohesive strategy. In the UK, we have the devolved regions. We have the problem, there's nothing which could in any way match the idea of a European strategy to solve the pandemic crisis, which is a social, political, economic, and so on crisis. And that's creating, of course, also a space where people get confused, not only that they get fed up, but they also get confused. And that's, of course, tying into the problem that increasingly people feel upset and anger and the articulation of this anger then might trigger joining any kind of public protest going against governments, okay? But the problem I'm trying to describe, or actually unwrap, is that there is a distinction between the legitimacy to have a protest, to protest the current governance, and not being clear on what it means to give a platform to extremist, violent, racist views. And that's what we have to tackle. Okay.
Right. You'll be back again in a minute, Ulrike, because I have a question to you, to Sanjeev and Lindsay from Rainer Bauberg, another of our Global Cit co-directors. Rainer says, your talks convey the impression of a continuous rise of right-wing nationalist populism. However, at least in Europe, there is also a perception that populist parties may have reached a plateau and their support in electoral terms has been declining in several countries. Also, the effects of populists in power from the US, the UK to Poland and Hungary may strengthen popular opposition. How strong do you think the potential for a backlash against populism is in the countries you've studied? And I might add, and answer with specific reference to citizenship. I'll turn first to Sanjeev to give an initial reflection on that.
Well, I think that it's probably too early to talk about a backlash, that it has reached a plateau. However, I want to make probably 3 points. One is, what makes the Hindu nationalist version of right-wing populism so powerful is because it's not really unique to them. After all, that's why I gave the background of the partition. They may be the most assertive proponent of it, but one can talk about always soft majoritarianism, if you like, which is much more pervasive. What I think, however, could happen, there are 2 things. One is, right now, the probably India of all major economies have been affected by COVID much worse than any other major economy. So it has been so dramatic, the effects. So clearly it's too early to say how that will play out. Second, this kind of, the current move, if you like, of Hindu majoritarianism is crucially dependent on the personality of the Prime Minister Modi. Right? So it's so person specific. After all, the BJP is an old party, but it has never been like this. So it's entirely possible that clearly Modi is not going to be there forever. That will change things. So I see the COVID's effects and Mr. Modi's kind of how long he'll be around as 2 specific things to look at to figure out whether it has plateaued or whether there will be a backlash. Until then, it's too early to say.
Lindsay.
Yeah, so I think that you could have a backlash and a deepening of opposition without necessarily meaning that right-wing populism is declining or losing power. I certainly think that there has been, like, as somebody who's coming from the United States, there certainly is a backlash here, but I would say that one of the key things is competence. And if they're able to deliver on core just governance issues, that some of that backlash can be a little bit more muted. And I'm thinking here for Bolsonaro in Brazil, while he has done abysmally on COVID, one of the things he has done is he's sent out massive benefits and transfers that are bigger than anything the left ever did. And so the amount of opposition to him, is strong when people hate him, but then among the median voter, it's sort of, oh, okay. And I probably think that Trump would have won re-election if it weren't for how poorly COVID went in the United States and how much it showed incompetence. And so I think that you could have both things where you have deepening opposition, increased mobilization without necessarily displacing or discrediting right-wing populism.
I'll go back to you, Ulrike. Do you want some more comments?
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Rainer, for this question. I would agree, and I've read also this kind of reports with a lot of relief to a certain degree that the rise of populist parties might have, again, passed the threshold, and more people also following what Lindsay was saying in terms of that the COVID-19 pandemic exposed incompetence largely. That said, the danger, or that's the reason why I prefer talking about the normalization of far-right populist orientations and racism. I think the danger that some of those orientations and normative understandings that were pushed by populist, far-right populist parties is not going away if the parties basically disappear. And to refer, for example, to the UK, the UKIP at some point changed into Brexit Party, and I heard they want to change their title name again. So at some point, the party says, if we've reached a point where our agenda basically becomes mainstream and has infiltrated a society, then we don't have to be there any longer. So the party is basically obsolete. So we can't do away with the problem that for more than 20 years we have the kind of institutionalized racism we are facing, and to think that the getting rid of populist parties would mean getting rid of this institutional racisms, and I'm consciously speaking in plural on this, is rather naive. And in my view, again, that's part of the problem, even if I would say optimistically, and the US, of course, is an indicator, and we don't know what the situation will be with the next election in the UK and elsewhere. But the legacy, let's say, the legacy of what far-right populism is about runs deeper than the political party representation of it.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. I'm going to address a question to Sarah now, and I gather from the fact she's marked it up, she's also going to say something about a question that's then come to everyone. So I'll go back to people. Question for Sarah. This is from Peter Northup. How do you see the recent salience of discussions about revoking the citizenship of terrorist/IS fighters fitting into the nexus of populism and citizenship? Related to that, Sarah's going to pick up or has indicated that she has something to say about a question from Lillian Frost, which is addressed to everybody, because I think this is pertinent, especially to Ulrike and Lindsay, and probably Sanjeev as well. Do these populist groups communicate with each other transnationally? In your research, have you come across examples of these groups learning from others and perhaps deploying similar language regarding citizenship and migration? Is this part of the recent trend of populism and citizenship becoming more prominent for the far right globally? I'll start with Sarah on the specific question, and then on the general one, and then I'll come back to the other speakers for reflections on the general question. Thank you for these great questions, by the way. There's still room for more.
So thank you for the question. It's I haven't seen mentions in manifestos, and right now that's sort of narrowly where my gaze is fixed at the minute. That's not to say, however, that these policies about citizenship revocation are not sort of highly salient, but linked to foreign policy and linked to how states think about the relationship to conflict in the world. And so in that sense, they're actually not reserved to the far right. They're sort of broad policy positions. But I think that this does link to that second question that Lillian Frost, hi out there, asks about how these parties and these movements are interconnected. So what makes sort of populism distinct today, and then thinking about the previous question, how their fortunes wax or wane based on each election, right? That what's new today is the sort of the global nationalism, right? That's the term that's used. That's not a contradiction of terms, that these are highly networked political movements that you see Nigel Farage showing up on a grandstand in, what was it, Alabama, right? For a senator, for Trump, right? That you see these connections. I know Dan Kellerman is a sort of a real critic of how the EU serves in this capacity and through the legitimation, for example, in the parliament. And so there are these institutional connections, there are these social networks that exist that makes global nationalism not just sort of an important device, but a script, an available resource that parties get to use that can sort of innovate new initiatives.
Okay, Lindsay, do you want to make any comments about transnational communication?
Yeah, I'll just say a few quick things. Yes, we definitely see this. And Ulrika mentioned QAnon. So that is a really interesting way of thinking about that spreading. But for the examples that I was talking about, you see very explicit connections between the National Rifle Association, top lobbying group on guns in the United States, and groups in Brazil. And a lot of the discussion of the right to bear arms, right to guns, that are based in language that's in the United States Constitution being picked up and used in similar ways in Brazil. And so you see a lot of those connections, and we see spread of the same language. And also social media is key in a lot of this, that you see linkages over Facebook, over WhatsApp, that help spread some of those messages and frames across different groups.
Ulrika.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, transnationalizing means that through social media, of course, the communication through social media, there's also copying. If you go back to the anti-hygienic protests that took place on that kind of scale in Germany, but you saw smaller ones in London and even in Belfast they tried. But it's interesting, I mean, without that kind of numbers and success, and even people from other European countries when they still had an opportunity to travel, they basically took a flight to go to Berlin to express their solidarity, but then it's clearly feeding into a transnational or transnationalization of this anger and the right as citizens to go to other countries even to protest against what's going on in these specific countries. So there's this kind of transnationalizing dynamic. Definitely, we can see this, yeah.
Okay, I'll turn to Sanjeev, but I'm going to add to Sanjeev's roster of questions along with the transnational communication question. Patty Leonard's question, which is, she says that it's a question to Sanjeev. You began by saying that populist parties like the BJP describe themselves as the true defender of the people against corrupt elites. Why is it that in India, this persistently manifests in anti-Muslim rhetoric and policies, since they aren't amongst the elites? Indeed, that's a general question that she has about populism, and presumably, why is it that fighting against the elites so often manifests itself in picking on a minority? Sanjeev, you've got something to say about that, I'm sure. Sure. And if the others want to come back on that question as well, that will be interesting.
On the transnational question, as you know, the kind of the populist party in India is so kind of particular in terms of its ideology of Hindu nationalism, etc., connected to the partition, etc. So it clearly learns from transnational things going on, but not necessarily from parties in the same sense. I would say, it'll fair to say, it seems to me, if it was not for the fact that the kind of global discourse against Islam post 9/11, right? Without that global discourse of Islam, of Islamic terrorism, etc., I'm quite sure Hindu nationalism in India would not have become such a powerful force, right? So in that sense, it certainly is sort of there are global things that is affecting all of this, right? On the other question from Patty Leonard, I think it is not so much that I'm saying that that a populist party is saying identifying elites correctly. It is more a matter of really their discourse being successful in calling certain people part of the corrupt elites, right? But clearly, whether that is a correct definition of elite is a different matter. So I would say that what you're calling it is picking on a minority. I would say that is exactly what I try to problematize, right? If you take into account the history of the partition, right? For the Hindu nationalists, it doesn't appear like a minority, if you like. At least that is their discourse, right? After all, if India and Pakistan was divided on the lines of that is their land and this is our land, why are we appeasing minorities, right? Clearly, that is obviously, so without that history, one can understand that. And so what it has succeeded in doing, it seems to me, so far, that identify a corrupt elite as English speaking, who are more secular, right? As or say NGOs who are really constantly trying to appeal to international allies, all of them as less than national forces, right? And all of them are elite in a very particular sense. They corrupt because they don't understand the soul of the nation, as it were, right? And so all of that probably is connected entirely to the history of the partition. So their self-presentation wouldn't be that they are picking on a minority. The self-presentation would be they're trying to make Indian democracy more real. I did right? Because after all, the word majority then is interesting, right? So after the word majority and democracy, in a way one could argue, taking, say, Linz's discussion of scripts, in some ways I would say the word democracy and majority, clearly those of us academics who understand democracy can't be only majority. Minority rights are important, institutions are important, but you can see it's a very easy leap from that to say, if India is a democracy, why aren't Indian institutions responding to what the majority wants? And the majority defined in a very particular way, the Hindu majority, right? So it's a very particular discourse where these terms get twisted, if you like. Thank you.
Great. Anyone else want to come in on this question about the relationship between the, yes, Ulrika.
Yeah, thanks. That's excellent, talking about the notion of the elite in the whole discourse of populism. And I mean, the interesting thing, and I'm following now what Sanjeev was saying, applying this to the Indian context, the relevance here is, of course, if we say, for example, a far-right populist group is criticizing a certain kind of elite, but it doesn't mean that they absolutely deny the function or the role of the elite. And that said, what's interesting was when Theresa May was still Prime Minister here in the UK, and I don't know whether you followed the details, at one of the gatherings of the Tory party, she was clearly saying or trying to impress the audience while saying, you know, we don't belong to the cosmopolitan elite, constructing herself and those in charge in governance as a communitarian elite. Again, against the cosmopolitan, but further also against perhaps new transnational/European elites emerging from the transformation of different European, I mean, I'm speaking from Europe, clearly, different elites through the possibilities of EU freedom movement and so forth, and new configurations of class as well and education. So we have to be very precise in terms of when we link the notion of elite to the populist discourses, what kind of elites actually are attacked. That said, quite often the critique of a group then of course comes with a package of a new elite basically repeating perhaps some of the mistakes of the old elite. I mean, with Theresa May, I always found this quite amusing because she was already part of the Tory government beforehand, as we know it, hostile environment, and you have it. So, but still the propaganda or the rhetoric is around constructing themselves as challenging the old elite, and that's essential.
Thank you very much. We've got a couple more questions and we're running out of time. I've got one question that's come from Magdalena Zabrochka, which I'm paraphrasing slightly, or actually she's paraphrased herself slightly in a helpful way, which is that whether or not there are certain types of changes to citizenship that might actually aggravate populist sentiment. And the particular one that she's interested in is citizenship by investment. She's interested in the regulation of citizenship by investment. But I think it's a very interesting question to consider the extent to which potentially it could be an aggravation of certain types of populist sentiment. Do any of you want to answer that question or address that question in any way?
I'll be happy to say something about it. May I?
Yes, please do. Please do.
Well, you know, I think the whole say buying citizenship, if you like, has been actually around for a long time. So what is interesting to what I'm always amazed by why that is not become an issue earlier, right? So the idea that you can really, because you have $500,000, you can invest and get citizenship, right? And it's been, I know Europe may be new, but the US, it has been around for a long time. But what's interesting is that it has not received attention. It's entirely possible that now it will receive more attention, just the way that, not now anymore. Now, let's hope Trump is over for the moment. But clearly what Trump was doing is precisely picking up those spaces, which were non-issues earlier. For instance, this is not the same example as yours. The example of, for instance, people who had temporary status because there was a hurricane somewhere. Trump decided they all should be expelled, right? Similar, so lots of those categories, even the idea of birth citizenship. So the Trump administration, not Trump himself, but certainly his advisors were so smart, one should say, they pick up all those quote unquote loopholes. So I can imagine then in the United States, citizenship because you're rich could have become an issue. But on the other hand, Trump might avoid exactly that kind of an issue, right? Because after all, we do know empirically that Kushner's real estate also involves using that particular category, right? Meaning some real estate investments where foreigners could invest, and he made full use of that space. So clearly it's not an issue that interests Trump very much, but actually these things have been around for a long time. But I think what populists are doing, at least in the US, picking them up in the last few years.
Okay. I think we'll move on to the very last question, which is a really enormous question that's coming from Bronwyn Manby. She started off commenting on considering Fukuyama and the end of history. What do you think the prospects for liberal democracy? And then she comes on a little later down. Do you think that today's information age means that liberal democracy is no longer sufficient as the best idea we can think of for government? Can the state still constrain and be constrained? Who would like to make any comments on that rather enormous question from Bronwyn? Yep, Sarah.
I'll jump in. I would add a caveat in that I don't think that there's a trade-off between being a liberal democracy and constraint, right? And this is kind of, a lot of political theorists, Habermas et al. Would go on about how there's no requirement to tolerate illiberalism in liberal spaces. That said, right, I don't think that this is something that the state does. It's something that citizens do. And I think the most worrying sign when we want to think prospectively about the fate of liberal democracy is decline of liberal norms among everyday citizens, right? So a lot of the research in the US, for example, looks at the prevalence of authoritarian norms in Democrats, lowercase d Democrats, right? And I think that that's the more worrying direction, is the sort of the decline of, I wouldn't call it civility, Ziblatt and Levitsky would refer to it as forbearance, decline of tolerance. Historically, we've had low levels of tolerance for certain groups, but the extent to which this becomes modeled by elites and individuals take partisan cues, I think, is probably the most worrying direction. So I don't know that it's a default of liberal democracy so much as it is like a choice of political leaders and a function of partisanship directly.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add any comments on that question?
Yes, briefly, I would say, even when I read End of History, I wasn't convinced then, in the 1990s. So clearly, one can, in terms of the kind of how liberal democracy is, one can talk about waves of liberal democracy, waves of democracy, and we certainly are living at a time of some kind of a challenge to liberal democracy, a decline to liberal democracy. But the optimist in me says that that this is not going to be permanent either. So is this so? In that sense, one hopes that this period will come to an end, and both the development in the US and what we earlier talked about, say in the Indian case, the fact that COVID will have such a huge effect, right? The fact that the current wave of populism is so dependent on Modi, a single personality, all that gives me hope that this too will pass. Thank you.
Do either, yes, Sarah, you just want to come back?
I do want to add something. It's not my view, it's Fukuyama's view. So 5 days ago, Politico ran this interview with 50 thinkers, and he concluded his thoughts on, like, it was about the legacies of Trump in a very sort of Joni Mitchell-esque way. He says, at the end of Trump's term, what I've learned is I really don't understand America at all. Like, it's very both sides now about, so we can certainly debate Fukuyama's terms, but I'm not sure that Fukuyama himself would agree with the premise at this point.
Lindsay, you've unmuted yourself. Is that with a view to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've just wanted to, there's so many things going on in this question. And I think we're in the midst of it, as Sanjeev says, that it's hard to know how it's going to turn out when you're in the midst of something. But the information part seems part of the key that makes things feel a little bit untethered. In addition to what Sarah says about shifting norms, and but it feels like things are kind of being pulled apart in terms of the different worlds that people are living in and views. And it's been a difficult past couple of years. I don't know.
Okay, well, we'll have to draw to a close now. Thank you very much. This has been, I think, a really interesting and engaged. Thank you. I want to thank all 4 presenters, not only for their papers, but also the way that they've generously engaged with each other's work and used that as a jumping off point, and also how they've responded to the very interesting questions. So that really brings us to the conclusion. Thank you very much to the Robert Schuman Center for hosting this webinar on citizenship and populism. And thank you to the audience for making it worthwhile. This has been a truly, I think, quite global event. Thank you.